I am Emily, 35 years old, and my own mother looked me dead in the eyes at my graduation dinner and told me she wished I was never born. I did not cry. I did not storm out. I simply stood tall, adjusted my dress, and told them to consider me as if I never existed. I told them to live their lives as though there was never a daughter named Emily. The entire restaurant went dead silent. The whole party froze. By the end of that night, I had watched federal investigators haul my brother-in-law away in handcuffs, and I initiated the foreclosure on my parents' mansion. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life for good. The night began at an exclusive steakhouse in downtown Atlanta. It was the kind of upscale establishment where reservations took months to secure, and the crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over heavy white linen tablecloths. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the glittering city skyline. I arrived early to make sure everything was perfectly arranged. I was 35 years old, an African-American woman who had just spent the last 3 years working myself to the bone to earn an executive master of business administration. I paid for every single credit hour out of my own pocket. I spent countless nights staring at my laptop screen until my vision blurred, skipping vacations and social events to build my future. I was wearing a tailored emerald green dress that made me feel powerful and accomplished. I felt incredibly proud of myself. But growing up in my family, my pride was never allowed to take up space. My parents, Winston and Valerie, built a very comfortable life, but their affection was treated like a strict currency. And all of that currency was spent entirely on my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was the undisputed golden child of the family. She had a bubbly personality and a flashy lifestyle that my parents paraded around our social circles like a shiny trophy. I was the quiet one, the scapegoat who preferred reading to pageants, the daughter whose achievements were constantly downplayed or ignored completely. Tonight was supposed to be my night to finally be recognized. I had kept my true financial success hidden from them for years. To them, I was just a mid-level corporate employee scraping by in the background. They had no idea I was actually the founder of a massive venture capital firm. I knew if they found out about my money, they would drain me dry to fund Chloe and her husband Connor. Connor is a wealthy white man who runs a flashy tech startup. My parents practically worship the ground he walks on, believing his presence elevates their own social status. My family arrived 30 minutes late to my graduation dinner. They did not even bother to apologize for keeping me waiting. My mother Valerie walked in wearing a designer gown that screamed for attention. My father Winston followed close behind, looking around the restaurant with a critical eye, as if judging whether the establishment met his high standards. Chloe and Connor strolled in last, laughing loudly and drawing the eyes of other diners. Chloe made sure to place her brand new designer handbag right on the table so everyone could see the expensive logo. There were no warm hugs for me. There were no smiles of pride for my monumental achievement. Instead, my mother immediately looked me up and down and sighed heavily. She asked me why I chose to wear green, claiming it washed out my complexion. She asked why I did not put more effort into styling my hair for such a nice dinner. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a polite smile. I reminded myself that this was my celebration and I was not going to let her ruin it. The host led us to our table, a prime spot near the large windows. The waiter pulled out our chairs and handed us menus bound in heavy leather. The passive aggression started before we even ordered our drinks. Connor leaned back in his chair, unbuttoned his custom suit jacket, and loudly complained about the traffic in downtown Atlanta. He then looked at me with a condescending smirk on his face. He asked me how my little night classes were going. I used the word little intentionally to diminish the grueling executive MBA program I had just completed. I calmly explained that I had officially graduated today with top honors. Chloe simply rolled her eyes and started scrolling on her phone, paying no attention to me at all. My father Winston grunted and said that going back to school at my age was a highly risky financial move. He told me I should be focusing on finding a husband instead of collecting degrees I probably would not even use in the real world. I kept my composure perfectly intact. I politely ordered a glass of sparkling water and focused my attention on the menu. The waiter took our orders and left the table. The conversation immediately shifted completely away from me. My mother clasped her hands together and leaned toward Chloe. She completely changed her tone, switching to a sweet melodic voice that she only ever used for my sister. She asked Chloe about her recent home renovations. For the next 45 minutes, the entire table listened with rapt attention as Chloe described the imported Italian marble she had selected for her master bathroom. My mother praised Chloe endlessly for her vision. She told her how brilliant her design choices were and how proud she was of her exquisite taste. My father nodded along, proudly boasting about how much market value the renovations would add to their suburban property. Connor sat there looking incredibly smug, wrapping his arm around Chloe and telling my parents that he only wants the absolute best for his beautiful wife. I sat there in silence, eating my salad, feeling completely invisible in my own life. I had just completed a grueling academic journey. I had earned a prestigious degree while working relentless hours to secure my future. But to my family, picking out bathroom tiles was a monumentally greater achievement than my graduation. I tried to join the conversation a few times. I attempted to share a brief story about my final capstone project, hoping to bring the focus back to the reason we were gathered here tonight. But every single time I spoke, my mother would swiftly interrupt me. She would talk right over my voice, asking the waiter for more bread, or pointing out someone else's outfit across the crowded dining room. It was a calculated and deliberate effort to erase me from my own celebration. The main courses arrived and the food was spectacular, but I could barely taste a single bite. The emotional toll of their blatant disregard was forming a heavy physical knot deep in my stomach. As the dinner plates were being cleared away, my mother picked up her crystal wine glass. She tapped her silver spoon against the delicate rim. The sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the bustling restaurant. Several nearby tables glanced over to see what was happening. My mother stood up, smoothing the front of her expensive dress. She commanded the attention of our table with practiced ease. I felt a brief, fragile flicker of hope spark inside me. I thought that maybe, just maybe, she was finally going to acknowledge my hard work. I thought she was going to give a toast in my honor for graduating. I was foolishly wrong. My mother smiled warmly and raised her glass directly toward my sister. She cleared her throat and began her speech. She said she wanted to take a special moment tonight to celebrate true success and family excellence. She talked about how incredibly proud she was of Chloe. She praised Chloe for creating such a beautiful home for Connor. She praised her for maintaining such an elegant lifestyle and for being a shining, perfect example of what a daughter should be. She went on and on about Chloe, highlighting every superficial detail of her life as if it were a massive worldly accomplishment. Chloe beamed, soaking up the praise like a sponge. Connor smirked and raised his glass in absolute agreement. My father nodded solemnly, entirely focused on my sister. I sat there, my hands gripping the silk napkin in my lap, feeling a cold numbness spread through my veins. The blatant disrespect was breathtaking to witness. My mother was actively using my graduation dinner to elevate the golden child at my expense. Then my mother slowly turned her gaze toward me. The warmth in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard glare. Her fake smile dropped completely from her face. She sighed loudly, a theatrical sound meant to convey deep exhaustion and profound disappointment. She lowered her glass slightly and addressed me in front of the entire table and anyone else sitting close enough to hear. She said that she supposed she should acknowledge my little milestone too. She called my graduation an embarrassing late start. She said that going back to school at 35 was a clear sign that I had failed to establish myself properly in my 20s like a normal person. She criticized my independent choices and said my quiet lifestyle was a constant humiliation to the family name. The venom in her voice was unmistakable. It was not a mother giving tough love. It was an enemy trying to draw blood. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the final blow. She said honestly, Emily, with all the headaches you have caused us by refusing to follow the family path, we wish you were never born. I did not cry. I did not storm away from the table. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood smoothing the front of my emerald dress. Then I looked directly at my mother and spoke in a perfectly calm voice. Then consider me as if I never existed. From this moment forward, Live your lives as though there was never a daughter named Emily. I calmly lowered myself back into my chair and adjusted my napkin. The silence stretched across the table, heavy and suffocating. The clinking of silverware from nearby tables felt deafening against our stillness. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my steak, savoring the rich flavor, while my family stared at me like I had just grown a second head. My mother remained standing, her mouth slightly ajar, as she struggled to process my total lack of submission. She was waiting for me to break, to apologize, to burst into tears, and run out of the dining room in shame. When I simply chewed my food with a serene smile, the spell finally broke. It was not my mother who spoke first. It was Chloe's husband, Connor. Connor shifted in his seat, leaning heavily across the white linen tablecloth. He was a man who reeked of unearned confidence, wearing a bespoke navy blue suit that my parents had undoubtedly helped finance. He let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. He looked at me with the kind of smug superiority reserved for people who have never had to struggle for a single thing in their entire lives. He shook his head slowly and told me I was being incredibly dramatic over a cute little degree. He actually used his fingers to make air quotes when he said the word degree, trying to diminish the monumental milestone I had just achieved. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with intense condescension. He told me that sitting in a classroom with a bunch of mid-level managers a few nights a week did not automatically make me a titan of industry. He said it was frankly adorable that I thought reading a few outdated textbooks gave me the right to speak to my mother with such blatant disrespect. According to Connor, I completely lacked the cultural pedigree required to understand how real power functioned in corporate America. He told me that real power was not about printing a certificate and putting it in a cheap wooden frame. Real power was about capital. It was about leverage, aggressive networking, and the inherent natural ability to command a room. He sneered and said a woman like me, grinding away in total anonymity, would never grasp the mechanics of high-level wealth. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply placed my fork down, resting my hands gracefully on the table. I looked at Connor, observing the arrogant tilt of his chin and the expensive watch gleaming on his wrist. It was absolutely fascinating to watch a man so utterly clueless lecture me about capital and leverage. I asked him in a smooth, even tone if real power meant relying on your father-in-law to fund your entire lifestyle. The comment hung in the air, sharp and incredibly precise. Chloe gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest in shock. Connor's face immediately flushed a deep, angry red. His smug smile vanished entirely, replaced by a hard, defensive scowl. Before Connor could formulate a response, my father erupted. Winston slammed his heavy hand flat against the table with tremendous force. The crystal wine glasses shuddered violently, and a few drops of red wine sloshed over the rims, staining the pristine white tablecloth. The sudden aggressive sound made my mother jump and sink back into her chair. My father leaned forward, his dark eyes blazing with a familiar, intimidating fury that used to terrify me when I was a helpless child. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. I demanded that I apologize to Valerie immediately. He said my behavior was absolutely disgusting and that I was intentionally ruining the mood of the evening. He called me an ungrateful child who had no respect for the people who gave her life. I looked at my father, refusing to back down or look away from his intense glare. I asked him exactly what I should be grateful for. The simple question seemed to enrage him even further. He raised his voice, ignoring the concerned glances from the restaurant staff hovering nearby. He reminded me that he had graciously offered me a secure position at his logistics company when I turned 18. He said he had given me the golden opportunity to learn the family business from the ground up, and I had arrogantly thrown it back in his face. He called me stubborn and foolish for walking away from his expert guidance. I kept my voice perfectly level, contrasting sharply with his escalating rage. I reminded him that his logistics company was already failing when I was a teenager. I told him I refused to tie my future to a sinking ship run by a man who refused to adapt to modern technology or update his business model. I reminded him that the moment I declined his job offer, he completely cut me off financially. I was 18 years old, packing my meager belongings into black garbage bags, because he told me that if I would not work for his company, I could not live under his roof. I worked 3 minimum-wage jobs just to keep the lights on in a tiny apartment while trying to put myself through my undergraduate program. My father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively at my memories. He said that was tough love. He claimed it was absolutely necessary to teach me how the real world worked, because I was far too headstrong for my own good. I turned my gaze toward Chloe, who was sitting quietly letting the men fight her battles while she sipped her champagne. I asked my father if tough love was the reason he and my mother had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into Chloe's luxury lifestyle. I laid out the indisputable facts right there at the dinner table. They had happily paid for Chloe's lavish destination wedding in the Caribbean. They had covered the massive down payment on her sprawling suburban mansion. And most importantly, they had continuously injected huge amounts of cash into Connor's flashy tech startup every single time he complained about cash flow issues. I pointed out the blatant, glaring hypocrisy of their parenting. I had to scrape together pennies to buy groceries and pay for my own textbooks, while they practically financed Connor's entire existence. My mother tried to intervene, her voice shaking with indignation. She said Connor was legally family now, and that investing in his brilliant startup was a vital investment in their collective future. She said Connor had a visionary mind that I could simply never comprehend with my limited corporate background. Connor nodded, his chest puffing out again as my mother fiercely defended his honor. He quickly regained his arrogant composure, enjoying the fact that my parents were fiercely protecting him against me. Connor laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed in our private section of the dining room. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down his nose at me. He said my jealousy was absolutely pathetic and sad to witness. He told me it was completely natural that my parents chose to back a guaranteed winner instead of throwing their hard-earned money down the drain on a woman who was just now managing to finish a basic degree. He said that successful people recognize and support other successful people. He claimed I was just bitter and angry because I had to do everything the hard way, while he and Chloe were thriving effortlessly in their superior social circles. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms wide in a grand gesture of total dominance. He told me I had a lot of nerve coming to an exclusive restaurant and acting like I owned the place. He said that true power was not about demanding respect with a bad attitude and a cheap dress. It was about proving you belonged at the table with the elite. He said I was completely out of my depth trying to play a high-stakes game with people who operated on a completely different financial level. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to show my parents that he was the absolute alpha at the table, the man who could put the disrespectful runaway daughter firmly back in her proper place. I watched him carefully, taking in every single detail of his arrogant performance. It was a spectacular masterclass in fragile male ego and unearned privilege. He was so incredibly desperate to prove his superiority that he was practically vibrating with aggressive energy. I did not interrupt his rant. I let him talk, allowing him to dig his own grave with every arrogant, boastful word that fell from his lips. I knew exactly what my massive financial portfolio looked like, and I knew exactly what his looked like. The staggering disparity between his confident facade and his actual grim reality was almost comical, but he had absolutely no idea that I held all the internal information. Connor decided it was the perfect time to teach me a brutal lesson in real power. He wanted to visually demonstrate the massive difference between my quiet independence and his supposedly limitless wealth. He wanted to break my spirit publicly and force me to submit to the family hierarchy once and for all. He smirked, locking his eyes onto mine with a dark, predatory gleam. He raised his right hand high in the air and loudly snapped his fingers. The sharp, cracking sound was meant to be highly authoritative, a demeaning signal to summon the waitstaff like obedient servants. He was preparing to deliver the final financial blow that would supposedly put me in my place and remind me exactly why I was the permanent outcast of this family. The sharp cracking sound of Connor snapping his fingers cut through the elegant dining room one more time. A waiter immediately hurried over to our table, looking incredibly nervous. He was carrying a sleek black leather folder that held the final bill for the evening. We had consumed multiple courses of premium aged steak imported seafood and several bottles of vintage wine that my parents had ordered without a single thought about the cost. The waiter extended his hand to place the folder near my father Winston, who traditionally paid for these lavish family dinners to showcase his status. But Connor intercepted the gesture. He reached out and snatched the leather folder right out of the waiter's hand with a smug sense of unearned entitlement. Connor opened the folder, and his eyes scanned the printed receipt. A slow, malicious smile spread right across his face. He looked at the total amount, and then he looked directly at me. The malicious glee in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew exactly what he was about to do. He wanted to use money as a weapon to force me into absolute submission. Connor closed the leather folder with a loud, deliberate slap. He did not hand it back to the waiter. Instead, he casually tossed it across the white linen tablecloth. It slid directly onto my empty dinner plate, landing with a heavy thud that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet tension of our private section. Connor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his tailored chest. He announced to the entire table that the total was exactly $4,500. He let that massive number hang in the air, ensuring every single person at the table heard it clearly. Then he looked at me with pure venom. He said since I was so fiercely independent and so highly educated now, I could go ahead and cover the cost of the celebration. He called it the family tax for my existence. He told me to pay the bill, apologize to my mother for my disrespectful outburst, and then get out of their sight. My mother Valerie did not object to this blatant financial bullying. In fact, she looked absolutely delighted. She sat up straighter in her chair, a cold, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She knew that a standard corporate salary would barely stretch to cover regular living expenses, let alone a spontaneous $4,500 dinner bill. She was waiting for the exact moment my composure would shatter. Chloe leaned into Connor, resting her hand on his shoulder, giggling softly at his cruel power play. They were a united front of arrogance, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my impending financial devastation. They expected me to panic. They wanted me to look at the massive bill and break down in tears, realizing I could not possibly pay it without draining my savings account. Connor's presence in our family was a masterclass in unearned privilege. My parents practically bent over backward to accommodate him, treating his tech startup like the second coming of Silicon Valley. He used his background like a blunt weapon, and tonight he was wielding it directly against me to protect his golden wife. He felt entirely too comfortable commanding a space that did not belong to him, acting as the ultimate gatekeeper of wealth and success. My father, Winston, a man who had built his own logistics company from scratch as an African-American entrepreneur, should have been insulted by this arrogant display from his son-in-law. But Winston was so blinded by his obsession with proximity to Connor's perceived status that he allowed his own daughter to be publicly degraded. It was a tragic testament to how deeply dysfunctional our family hierarchy had become. I glanced around the table at my extended family. My aunts and uncles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, refusing to make eye contact with me. They stared down at their half-empty wine glasses or inspected their cloth napkins. Not a single person spoke up to defend me. Not one person suggested that forcing a 35-year-old woman to pay an exorbitant bill as a form of punishment was completely unhinged. They were terrified of crossing my parents and losing their own access to the family wealth. They chose silent complicity, allowing my brother-in-law to publicly humiliate me simply because I refused to play my assigned role. My father, Winston, just crossed his arms and watched me with a stern, unforgiving glare, waiting for me to pull out my debit card and inevitably face the embarrassment of a declined transaction. The psychological warfare was painfully obvious. They wanted to remind me that no matter how many degrees I earned, I would never have the capital to sit at their level. They wanted to prove that my quiet grind was worthless compared to their loud, parent-funded luxury. I looked down at the black leather folder sitting on my plate. I thought about the years I had spent wearing thrift store clothes and eating cheap noodles just to pay for my undergraduate classes, while my parents bought Chloe brand new luxury cars. I thought about the countless times I had been excluded, minimized, and treated like a financial burden simply for existing. Connor even had the audacity to suggest that I could set up a payment plan with the restaurant if my little bank account could not handle the sudden charge. He laughed a booming, arrogant sound that made my blood boil. He told the waiter to stand by and make sure the transaction actually cleared because he highly doubted my credit limit was high enough to cover their expensive tastes. The waiter looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting to be anywhere else in the world. He kept his eyes averted, a silent witness to this brutal family execution. The waiter cleared his throat nervously, breaking the heavy silence for just a fraction of a second. He asked politely if I would prefer to split the bill among the table. Connor immediately shot the waiter a dark warning look. He barked out that the bill was not to be split under any circumstances. He reiterated that I was the one footing the entire cost of the evening to make up for my utterly disrespectful attitude. My aunt, who sat 2 seats away from me, let out a tiny, barely audible gasp, but she quickly covered her mouth and looked down at her lap. The absolute cowardice of my extended relatives was just as infuriating as the direct attack from my mother and brother-in-law. They were perfectly willing to feast on imported lobster and expensive cuts of beef, but they refused to offer a single word of support when the person celebrating her graduation was being financially extorted. Chloe whispered something in Connor's ear and they both chuckled. She then looked at me and said that maybe I should have thought twice about ruining her mood before offering to host a dinner I clearly could not afford. She said that real adults know how to pay for their own mistakes. The sheer hypocrisy of her statement was staggering. This was a woman who had never paid a single utility bill with her own earned money in her entire life. She lived in a suburban mansion financed by my parents and drove a vehicle paid for by her husband's startup investors. Yet she sat there judging my financial worth with absolute impunity. The tension in the dining room reached its absolute peak. The silence was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the space. My mother leaned forward, her eyes wide with eager anticipation, waiting for the inevitable moment of my total surrender. She wanted me to beg. She wanted me to ask my father for help, to admit that I was in over my head and that I desperately needed their financial rescue. If I did that, they would own me forever. They would hold this dinner over my head for the rest of my natural life, using it as definitive proof that my independence was nothing but a pathetic illusion. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air of the restaurant fill my lungs. The sheer audacity of the situation was almost comical. They truly believed that a bill of $4,500 would be my ultimate ruin. They believed my salary from whatever mid-level corporate job they assumed I held would be completely wiped out by this single meal. They wanted to send me back to my apartment with an empty bank account and a crushed spirit. They wanted me to wake up tomorrow morning, stressing about how I was going to afford my rent and groceries just like I had to when I was an 18-year-old girl cast out of their home. But I was no longer an 18-year-old girl terrified of the world and desperate for their validation. I was a 35-year-old woman who had navigated the brutal, ruthless world of high finance entirely on my own terms. I had faced down aggressive boardroom executives, hostile takeover attempts, and relentless corporate negotiations. Connor's little temper tantrum and my mother's petty high school mean girl tactics were absolutely nothing compared to the battles I fought and won every single day. I looked down at the black leather folder sitting on my plate. I reached out and rested my fingertips lightly against the smooth surface. The leather was cool to the touch. I slowly looked up, scanning the faces around the table one by one. I looked at my mother Valerie, whose fake smile was plastered onto her face, masking a deep well of insecurity and malice. I looked at my father Winston, whose arms were firmly crossed, a silent enforcer of the family's toxic rules. I looked at my sister Chloe, whose entire identity was entirely dependent on the money and validation provided by the people sitting beside her. And finally, I looked at Connor, the arrogant orchestrator of this pathetic financial ambush. I did not flinch. I did not break a sweat. I did not let a single ounce of fear show on my face. The cold, icy calm that had settled over me earlier only grew stronger. I felt an incredible surge of power coursing through my veins because I knew something none of them could even begin to fathom. I looked at the leather folder, then up at Connor's smug, irritating face. I reached down to the empty chair beside me. and slowly picked up my designer clutch. It was a custom piece, an understated but incredibly expensive accessory that my mother had completely failed to recognize. I unclasped the hardware with a soft metallic click that echoed in the quiet space. I looked directly into Connor's eyes, letting a genuine smile touch my lips. "You are right, Connor," I said, my voice perfectly steady and resonant. "An education is incredibly expensive. Let us see exactly what mine bought me." I slowly withdrew my hand from the silk-lined interior of my custom evening clutch. I did not pull out a standard bank debit card or a basic corporate credit card with a meager limit. Instead, I retrieved a solid, weighty block of anodized titanium. It was a matte black American Express Centurion card. This was not a card you could simply apply for online or acquire by having a decent executive salary. It was an invitation-only status symbol reserved exclusively for ultra-high net worth individuals. To even be considered for this specific piece of metal, you had to spend and pay off millions of dollars annually. It represented immense liquid wealth and absolute financial dominance. I held it between my index and middle finger, letting the ambient light of the massive crystal chandeliers catch the subtle dark metallic sheen of its surface. I moved my hand forward with deliberate slowness. I placed the heavy titanium card directly onto the center of the black leather billfold that Connor had so aggressively tossed onto my plate. The card hit the leather with a distinct solid thud that sounded incredibly loud in the tense, suffocating silence of our dining table. I did not break eye contact with my brother-in-law for a single second. I watched his face intently, waiting for his brain to process the visual information resting right in front of him. Connor was a tech startup founder, a man utterly obsessed with wealth capital and elite status markers. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he would recognize exactly what I had just placed on the table. It took exactly 3 seconds for the reality to fully register. I watched the arrogant, smug smirk literally melt off his face. It was as if someone had pulled a hidden plug and drained all the unearned confidence straight out of his body. His jaw went slack and his eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated shock. He stared at the matte black card as if it were a venomous snake that had just crawled onto the white linen tablecloth. His shoulders, which had been puffed out all evening in a display of aggressive dominance, suddenly slumped forward. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head slightly, as his mind scrambled to calculate how his supposedly struggling sister-in-law could possibly possess the most exclusive financial instrument in the world. I knew the initiation fee alone was more than most people made in an entire year. He knew the spending requirements were astronomical. The realization that I possessed a level of capital that absolutely dwarfed his fragile venture-backed startup funding hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He stopped breathing. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small in his expensive tailored suit. He tried to swallow, but his throat seemed to have gone completely dry. Chloe, sitting right next to him, felt the sudden violent shift in his energy. She looked at her husband and frowned, her perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together in deep confusion. She glanced down at the table and saw the black card sitting on the bill. To Chloe, it was just a dark piece of metal. She lacked the financial literacy to understand its massive significance. She tugged impatiently at Connor's sleeve and asked him what was wrong. She asked him why he was staring at my credit card like he had just seen a ghost. She let out a small, nervous laugh and told him to just let the waiter run the card so they could finally watch my bank account decline and get this over with. Connor did not answer her. He could not even find the breath to speak. He just kept staring at the titanium card, completely paralyzed by the sudden violent shift in our power dynamic. My father, Winston, leaned forward in his chair, narrowing his dark eyes. He noticed Connor's sudden silent panic, and it deeply unsettled him. Winston was accustomed to Connor being the loudest, most confident man in the room. Seeing his golden son-in-law reduced to a speechless, gaping statue made Winston incredibly uncomfortable. He demanded to know what was going on. He commanded me to stop playing childish games and just pay the damn bill like I had been instructed so we could end this embarrassing family spectacle. My mother, Valerie, also sensed the rapidly shifting atmosphere. Her triumphant, cruel smile faltered slightly. She looked from Connor's pale face to my perfectly calm expression, trying desperately to understand how I had managed to silence the man they practically worshipped. She sat up straighter, clutching her napkin anxiously, sensing that her carefully orchestrated public humiliation was rapidly derailing in front of her eyes. She opened her mouth to hurl another insult, but the words died in her throat when she looked at my face. I was not looking at her with fear or submission. I was looking at them all with the calm, clinical detachment of a predator observing its trapped prey. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the waiter approaching our table. He was walking with brisk, tentative steps, clearly bracing himself for an awkward and potentially hostile interaction. He had witnessed the entire aggressive exchange earlier. He had seen Connor snatch the bill and throw it at me. He fully expected to pick up a basic bank card and return a few minutes later to discreetly inform me that my transaction had been declined due to insufficient funds. He stopped at the edge of our table, keeping his eyes politely averted to avoid staring directly at my family's palpable tension. He reached out his hand toward the black leather folder to collect his payment. As the waiter's hand hovered over the table, his gaze finally landed on the heavy matte black titanium card sitting on top of the printed receipt. I watched his entire physical demeanor transform in a fraction of a second. His professional restaurant training kicked in instantly. High-end elite establishments like this one trained their staff extensively on how to recognize and handle ultra-high net worth clients. The waiter knew exactly what a Centurion card represented. I knew it meant he was dealing with a customer whose net worth commanded absolute flawless, uninterrupted service. The waiter instantly pulled his hand back, as if he had almost committed a grave, unforgivable error. He stood perfectly straight, smoothing the front of his crisp apron, and then offered a deep, respectful bow of his head. The nervous apprehension he had displayed just moments ago vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, terrified reverence. He stammered slightly as he spoke, his voice dropping to a hushed, deferential tone. He addressed me as ma'am, completely ignoring Connor, my father, and my mother. He asked me if everything regarding the meal had been to my absolute satisfaction. He asked if there was anything else, anything at all that the executive chef or the kitchen could prepare for me before he processed the payment. My extended family watched this interaction in absolute stunned silence. My aunts and uncles, who had refused to defend me earlier, were now staring at the waiter with wide, disbelieving eyes. They had seen this same waiter act perfectly polite, but somewhat aloof throughout the entire evening while serving my parents. Now he was treating me with a level of deep, subservient respect that my parents and Connor had completely failed to command, despite all their loud boasting and expensive orders. The visual contrast was absolutely stunning. The staff member was honoring the quiet scapegoat daughter with a level of deference reserved for royalty, while completely ignoring the loud, arrogant family members who had tried to humiliate her just moments prior. Connor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He opened his mouth to speak to regain some semblance of control over the situation, but no words came out. The harsh reality of his own financial insignificance was actively suffocating him. He had tried to use a $4,500 dinner bill to crush my spirit and prove his immense superiority. Instead, he had inadvertently set the perfect public stage for me to reveal that my financial resources could swallow his entire life without making a single ripple. He looked at me, and for the first time in his entire life, he looked genuinely terrified. He realized he had walked into a trap he did not even know existed. The waiter took a small, respectful step forward, extending his hand once again to carefully retrieve the titanium card and the leather folder. He assured me he would handle the transaction personally and return the card to me with the utmost speed. He promised he did not want to keep me waiting for even a moment longer than necessary. I let his fingers graze the edge of the black folder before I finally made my move. I raised my right hand gracefully, lifting a single manicured finger to halt his movement. The waiter stopped, instantly freezing in place, awaiting my command like a loyal soldier. I looked directly across the wide table, holding Connor's horrified, panicked gaze captive in mine. I spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm, carrying the cool, effortless, absolute authority of someone who truly owned the room. I told the waiter that he actually did not need to bother running the card tonight. I smiled a slow, genuine, beautiful smile and told him to just put the entire bill on the owner's tab. The waiter stood absolutely frozen for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted from the heavy titanium card resting on the leather folder up to my face. He swallowed hard, his posture rigid with professional deference. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging my quiet command without a single hesitation. He softly replied that it would be his absolute pleasure to handle the matter exactly as I requested. He did not touch the card. He simply picked up the black leather folder with both hands and backed away from the table, retreating toward the kitchen with hurried, panicked steps. The air at our table grew incredibly thick. Connor let out a harsh, nervous laugh that sounded more like a bark. He shifted his weight aggressively in his chair, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, as if physical movement could somehow restore his shattered authority. He looked at me with a mixture of deep confusion and rising anger. He demanded to know what kind of pathetic stunt I was trying to pull. He asked if I knew the restaurant owner from one of my little night classes, or if I was simply making a fool of myself to avoid paying the bill. He confidently declared that the management was going to come out here and publicly humiliate me for trying to fake a tab. My father, Winston, crossed his heavy arms over his chest, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He told me to stop playing games immediately. He said I was embarrassing the family and that he would not tolerate a grown woman acting like a petulant child in a fine dining establishment. He reached for his own wallet, fully intending to forcefully take control of the situation and pay the $4,500 bill himself. He wanted to be the savior to maintain his rigid position as the ultimate financial provider of the family. I did not stop him. I simply watched him fumble with his leather wallet, my face perfectly calm and utterly serene. Before my father could pull out a single credit card, a sudden flurry of movement caught the attention of the entire dining room. The general manager of the restaurant, a distinguished older man in a flawless tuxedo, was practically sprinting across the floor. He was followed closely by two senior waitstaff members who were carrying a silver bucket filled with ice and an incredibly rare bottle of vintage champagne. The manager bypassed my father entirely. He bypassed Connor. I walked directly to my side of the table and stopped, coming to a perfect, respectful halt. The manager offered a deep bow, his face radiating absolute professional reverence. He addressed me by my name, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent table. He thanked me profusely for gracing his establishment with my presence this evening. He apologized with deep sincerity that he had not been informed of my arrival earlier. I explained that if he had known I was dining with them tonight, he would have personally ensured that the private dining room was reserved exclusively for my family. He gestured to the vintage champagne, explaining it was a humble token of his immense gratitude for my continued partnership. Connor scoffed loudly, his face turning a dark shade of crimson. He leaned forward and demanded to know why the general manager of a world-class steakhouse was treating me like royalty. He pointed an accusatory finger at my face and told the manager there had to be some kind of massive mistake. Connor aggressively stated that I was just a mid-level corporate worker who could not even afford the appetizers on the menu. I insisted that the manager needed to bring the bill back immediately so he could pay it and end this ridiculous charade. The general manager slowly turned to look at Connor. The deep, subservient respect he had just shown to me vanished instantly. He looked at my brother-in-law with the cold, polite disdain that high-level service professionals reserve for loud, arrogant patrons who do not understand how true wealth operates. The manager stated clearly and confidently that there was no mistake. He explained to Connor that he was speaking to the owner of the very building they were currently sitting in. The entire table stopped breathing. Chloe dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate, but she did not even blink. My father froze, his hand still gripping his wallet, his mouth slightly open in complete disbelief. My mother, Valerie, suddenly looked as if all the blood had been violently drained from her body. I smiled gently at the manager and thanked him for the beautiful bottle of champagne. I told him he was doing a spectacular job running the restaurant and that I was very pleased with the revenue reports his team had submitted last quarter. I casually mentioned that my holding company was looking forward to renewing their commercial lease for another 10 years because I valued tenants who understood the importance of flawless execution. The manager bowed again, thanking me for my generosity, and retreated discreetly, leaving my family to drown in the devastating reality of my words. I turned my attention back to the table, resting my hands on the white linen tablecloth. I looked directly at Connor. I explained to him in a slow, methodical voice that I did not just have a cute little corporate job. I explained that over the last decade, while he and my parents were busy parading around the suburbs and burning through cash to maintain a flashy image, I was quietly building an empire. I told him that my private real estate holding company owned this entire commercial block. I owned the luxury retail spaces on the ground floor. I owned the boutique fitness center next door. And I owned the massive square footage of this exclusive steakhouse. I watched the devastating truth wash over my family. The $4,500 dinner bill that Connor had tried to use to crush my spirit was literal pennies compared to the commercial rent I collected from this single property every single month. I did not just have enough money to cover the family tax. I had enough liquid capital to buy and sell Connor's entire existence 100 times over without checking my bank balance. The psychological warfare they had waged against me all evening completely imploded. The massive, towering hierarchy they had built to keep me at the absolute bottom of the family structure shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. My father, Winston, looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His entire identity was wrapped up in being the wealthy, patriarchal provider. He had used his failing logistics company to justify cutting me off financially when I was 18 years old. He had told me I would never survive without his money and his guidance. Now, sitting in a building owned entirely by the daughter he had cast out, he was forced to realize that I had eclipsed his financial achievements so completely that he was essentially a peasant sitting at my table. He slowly withdrew his hand from his wallet, his shoulders slumping in total absolute defeat. But it was my mother Valerie who reacted with the most predictable and sickening display of manipulation. The moment she fully comprehended that her scapegoat daughter possessed serious generation-shifting wealth, her entire demeanor violently pivoted. The cold, hateful glare that had accompanied her cruel toast vanished completely. The color rushed back into her face and she plastered on a desperate, eager smile. She practically lunged across the table, reaching out with both hands to grab my arm. Her voice shifted instantly, returning to that fake, sweet melodic tone she normally reserved exclusively for Chloe. She called me her sweet, beautiful girl. She let out a high-pitched, breathless laugh and asked me why I had kept such a wonderful, massive secret from my own mother. She told me how incredibly proud she was of my real estate empire. She had the absolute terrifying audacity to suggest that my immense success was the direct result of her brilliant parenting. She looked around the table at my stunned aunts and uncles and proudly proclaimed that her tough love had pushed me to achieve greatness. She said she always knew I was destined for monumental wealth, and she just wanted to push me out of my comfort zone so I could realize my potential. The sheer lack of shame was breathtaking. Less than 15 minutes ago, she had looked me dead in the eyes and loudly wished that I had never been born. Now she was desperately trying to claim credit for the very empire I built to survive her abuse. She squeezed my arm, her eyes wide and greedy. She told me we needed to schedule a private lunch immediately so I could tell her all about my commercial properties. She said she would be more than happy to help me manage my massive portfolio because family must always protect family wealth. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a cold, clinical disgust. I slowly, deliberately pulled my arm out of her grasp. I did not raise my voice, but my tone was sharp enough to cut through solid steel. I told her to stop talking. I told her that she did not get to rewrite history just because she suddenly realized I had more money than her golden child. I reminded her of the exact words she had spoken during her toast. I told her that my success belonged entirely to me and she would never see a single dime of it. My mother shrank back into her chair, her fake smile trembling as the reality of my absolute rejection set in. Chloe looked terrified, gripping her designer handbag as if it were a life preserver. She realized that her position as the wealthy superior sister had just been permanently eradicated. I ignored my mother's pathetic, desperate backpedaling and turned my head slowly. I locked eyes with my brother-in-law. Connor was sweating profusely now. The collar of his custom-tailored suit suddenly looked far too tight around his neck. He was staring at me like a man standing on the tracks watching a freight train barreling directly toward him. I smiled a calm, terrifying smile. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, interlacing my fingers. I spoke directly to him, letting my voice carry across the silent, terrified family. I am not just in real estate, I said smoothly. You mentioned earlier that I lack the cultural pedigree to understand real business, Connor. You said I was out of my depth playing a high-stakes game with the elite. Well, let us play. Let us talk about your startup. The words hung in the air like a threat. Let us talk about your startup. I watched Connor closely as the implications of my invitation washed over him. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. He reached for his crystal water glass with a trembling hand, taking a large gulp in a desperate attempt to moisten his dry throat. He was trying to regain his footing, to reassert the arrogant dominance he had wielded just 20 minutes prior. He set the glass back down on the white linen tablecloth. He scoffed, attempting to sound dismissive, but the sound was thin and entirely devoid of its previous power. He told me that my little real estate portfolio was completely irrelevant to the tech industry. He said that collecting commercial rent checks from restaurants and boutique gyms was a basic passive income strategy for people who lacked the visionary intellect required to disrupt global markets. I did not interrupt him. I let him speak because every word he uttered only highlighted his profound ignorance. He actually believed that my ownership of this commercial block was the absolute pinnacle of my success. He was trying to convince himself that I was just a lucky property owner who had stumbled into a lucrative real estate deal. My father, Winston, leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes darting between Connor and me. Winston was a man who understood the fundamental mechanics of wealth, even if his own logistics company was currently struggling. He knew that owning a commercial building of this magnitude required massive upfront capital and impeccable credit. He knew it was not for amateurs. But Winston was also desperately clinging to the hierarchy he had established. He wanted to believe Connor was still the smartest man at the table. I reached down into the plush interior of my designer bag. I bypassed my wallet and my keys, allowing my fingers to brush against the smooth, cool glass of my iPad Pro. I grasped the device and pulled it out, setting it gently on the table right next to the heavy matte black titanium Centurion card. The screen was dark, reflecting the warm golden light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. Chloe leaned away from her husband, staring at the tablet with a mixture of apprehension and intense curiosity. My mother, Valerie, remained entirely silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap, terrified of what I was going to reveal next. She had already been thoroughly humiliated by her complete failure to recognize my financial status, and she did not want to provoke another public dressing down. I looked directly at Connor. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, conveying the calm, effortless authority of a woman who was entirely in control of the narrative. I told him that he was absolutely right about one thing. I told him that commercial real estate was indeed a basic passive income strategy. I explained that acquiring this building and the surrounding properties was just a side project, a simple diversification tactic I employed to park excess capital and generate reliable monthly dividends. I said it was a hobby I picked up to keep myself entertained on the weekends. The sheer audacity of calling a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate portfolio a weekend hobby made my father choke slightly on his breath. I rested my hands on the table flanking the dark screen of my iPad. I explained to Connor that my true profession, the career I had spent the last decade building from the ground up, operated on a completely different level. I told him I had intentionally kept my identity hidden behind layers of non-disclosure agreements, proxy boards, and legal shields. I explained that in my specific line of work, anonymity was the ultimate strategic advantage. It allowed me to evaluate businesses and analyze desperate founders without my personal background clouding the judgment of the market. I told him that while he was busy plastering his face all over social media and paying for superficial magazine features to look successful, I was operating in the shadows, quietly controlling the actual flow of capital. Connor shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. The arrogant sneer had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a growing sense of profound dread. He was a man who operated in the venture capital ecosystem of the Southeast. He knew that there were unseen power players who held the strings to the regional economy. He was starting to realize that he might have just spent the entire evening mocking one of them. He asked me in a voice that betrayed his rising panic exactly what it was that I did. He demanded to know what kind of shadow corporation I was running that required so much intense secrecy. He was desperately hoping I would name some mid-tier boutique agency that he could easily dismiss or mock. I did not blink. I did not look away from his terrified eyes. I delivered the crushing blow with absolute surgical precision. I told him that I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Vanguard. The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic. The name Apex Vanguard did not just drop onto the table, it detonated like a massive explosive device. Winston physically recoiled his back, hitting the chair with a dull thud. My father followed the financial news religiously. He knew exactly what Apex Vanguard was. It was widely known as one of the most ruthless and heavily capitalized venture capital firms in the southeastern United States. It was a firm famous for executing hostile takeovers and completely destroying the careers of incompetent founders. The fact that his quiet scapegoat daughter was the architect of that financial behemoth completely shattered his reality. But Connor's reaction was entirely different. All the blood rushed out of his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw literally dropped open and his eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death warrant. He gripped the edges of the dining table so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He stopped breathing. The name Apex Vanguard meant something very specific and very terrifying to him. For the past 6 months, Connor had been desperately, aggressively, and anonymously pitching Apex Vanguard for a massive Series C financial bailout. His tech startup was bleeding cash at an unprecedented, terrifying rate. He had burned through his initial investor capital to fund the lavish lifestyle he shared with my sister Chloe. He had bought luxury vehicles and taken extravagant vacations, all while his company quietly crumbled behind the scenes. I knew that without an immediate injection of institutional capital, his entire flashy facade would collapse into criminal ruin. He had been sending pleading emails, submitting doctored pitch decks, and practically begging the unseen partners at Apex Vanguard to save his company and his personal freedom. He had absolutely no idea that the ruthless anonymous chief executive officer he had been desperately pitching for half a year was the exact same woman he was currently mocking over a restaurant bill. He had just spent the last hour verbally abusing calling a failure and demanding financial submission from the one person holding the absolute keys to his entire existence. Chloe looked frantically between her husband and me. She lacked the corporate literacy to understand the specific gravity of the name, Apex Vanguard, but she could read the sheer, unfiltered terror radiating from her husband's body. She grabbed his arm, shaking him slightly, and demanded to know what was going on. She asked him why he looked like he was about to be physically sick. Connor could not even look at his wife. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare of his own arrogant making. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was waiting for the final blow to land. I slowly reached out and touched the home button on my iPad Pro. The screen instantly glowed to life, illuminating my face with a cool blue light. I tapped in my secure passcode, unlocking the device, and bypassing the multiple layers of enterprise-grade encryption. I opened a specific encrypted financial dossier that my forensic accounting team had compiled just a few weeks prior. I looked at the highly confidential catastrophic numbers organized neatly into red columns across the screen. I smiled a very cold, predatory smile. I told Connor that his aggressive pitching strategy was certainly persistent, but his accounting practices left a tremendous lot to be desired. I picked up the iPad, holding it firmly. I slowly turned the bright glowing screen around so it directly faced my brother-in-law. I watched Connor's panicked eyes track the data brightly illuminated on the sleek screen. Displayed in high-resolution clarity was his tech company's highly confidential, catastrophic internal financial ledger, exposing his absolute financial ruin to everyone sitting at the dining table tonight. I kept the iPad perfectly angled, ensuring the glare of the crystal chandeliers did not obscure the screen. I watched Connor's eyes dart frantically across the illuminated columns of red ink. The silence in our private dining section was absolute. I did not just show him the screen. I began to read the numbers out loud, letting my voice carry clearly and precisely across the large table so every single aunt, uncle, and cousin could hear the undeniable truth. I read his monthly cash burn rate, which was astronomical. I read the fabricated user acquisition metrics he had used to deceive early backers. I read the fraudulent revenue projections he had aggressively pitched to my associates at Apex Vanguard. I laid out the precise mathematical anatomy of a dying company. Connor was physically crumbling before my eyes. The arrogant, wealthy tech founder, who had tried to humiliate me with a $4,500 dinner bill, was now sweating profusely. Large drops of perspiration formed on his forehead and rolled down his temples, soaking into the collar of his expensive custom suit. He opened his mouth to deny the numbers, to claim the data was somehow fabricated, but the sheer staggering level of detail on the screen made any defense completely impossible. The forensic accountants at my firm had spent weeks tearing his business apart, line by line. We had mapped every single bank account, every shell company, and every hidden transaction he thought was secure. I did not stop at this business metrics. I smoothly swiped my finger across the glass screen, pulling up the second page of the highly confidential financial dossier. I looked directly at Chloe, whose smug expression had vanished, leaving behind a mask of total confusion. I told the entire table that Connor was not just a terrible businessman running a hollow shell of a startup. I announced that my firm's comprehensive audit had uncovered a massive, sustained pattern of criminal embezzlement. I explained that Connor had been actively and systematically draining millions of dollars of investor capital to personally finance his wife's extravagant lifestyle. Chloe gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the quiet space. I looked right at her and began listing her specific luxury assets. I detailed the two matte black G-Wagons sitting in the driveway of her suburban mansion. I pointed out the seasonal designer handbags she loved to flaunt on social media, including the expensive purse currently on our dining table. I listed the lavish five-star vacations to the Maldives and the Amalfi Coast that she had bragged about for the last 3 years. I told her that none of those things were paid for by a successful tech enterprise. They were paid for with stolen money. I explained how Connor had set up bogus vendor contracts and phantom consulting fees, funneling institutional investment capital directly into personal offshore accounts. He was using funds meant for software development and employee payroll to buy Chloe diamonds and imported Italian marble for her master bathroom. He had constructed a magnificent, towering illusion of the perfect, wealthy white knight brother-in-law, and I was burning it to the ground with a single glowing tablet. Chloe let out a piercing, high-pitched shriek. The sound was a mix of absolute horror and deeply offended vanity. She whipped her head around to stare at her husband. She demanded that Connor say something to defend himself right now. She yelled at him to tell me I was lying, to prove that his company was the massive success he had always claimed it was. But Connor could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his tailored jacket. He looked down at his lap, completely unable to meet his wife's panicked gaze. His total silence was the loudest confession anyone could have ever made. The illusion shattered completely. The perfect golden couple of the family was instantly reduced to a pair of desperate frauds. Chloe realized in that exact moment that her entire identity, her entire social standing, and her entire life of unearned luxury was a criminal facade. The money was not real. The prestige was not real. The only thing that was real was the impending catastrophic ruin staring them in the face. She began to hyperventilate, clutching her diamond necklace as if she could somehow protect her stolen assets by holding onto them tightly. She turned away from her husband and looked frantically toward the head of the table. She locked eyes with our mother Valerie and our father Winston. Chloe began begging them to do something. Her voice cracked as she pleaded with them to shut me up, to fix the situation, and to make the nightmare go away. She cried out that I was ruining her life and intentionally destroying her marriage just because I was jealous of her happiness. Even in the face of undeniable proof of federal financial crimes, the golden child instinctively played the victim. She completely ignored the fact that she had personally benefited from millions of dollars of stolen investor funds and instead focused all her rage on the person who exposed the truth. My extended family watched this catastrophic meltdown in absolute horror. My aunts and uncles sat paralyzed in their chairs, their eyes wide with shock. The niece they had previously dismissed as a quiet, struggling corporate worker had just methodically dismantled the most powerful man in their family hierarchy. They realized that the lavish lifestyle they had all envied and admired was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on felony embezzlement. The power dynamic of the entire extended family was permanently and violently reversed. Winston sat at the head of the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of dark purple. My father was a man who demanded absolute control and demanded that his family project an image of flawless excellence to the outside world. He had spent years propping up Connor, treating him like the ultimate standard of success, while treating me like a burdensome failure. Now he was being forced to watch his prized son-in-law be publicly exposed as a pathetic criminal fraud. Worse, he was being forced to watch his scapegoat daughter command the room with a level of wealth and authority he could never hope to achieve. The humiliation was too much for Winston to bear. His pride could not handle the reality that he had backed the wrong horse. He could not accept that the daughter he had thrown out at 18, the daughter he had deemed unworthy of his logistics company, was currently holding the executioner's axe over his golden family. The cognitive dissonance fueled a rapid, dangerous escalation of his legendary temper. Winston's breathing became heavy and ragged. He glared at me, his dark eyes burning with a furious intensity. He did not care about the embezzlement. He did not care that Connor was stealing from investors or risking federal prison. He only cared that I had dared to bring this humiliation to his dinner table. He only cared that I had disrespected his authority by proving myself vastly superior to his chosen favorite. Winston erupted in a sudden violent fury. He roared my name, his voice booming like thunder across the upscale dining room. He lunged forward in his seat and slammed his heavy fist down onto the white linen tablecloth with terrifying force. The impact shook the entire table. The crystal wine glasses toppled over instantly. Deep red wine spilled across the pristine white fabric, spreading like a pool of fresh blood. The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed through the restaurant, causing diners at neighboring tables to jump in alarm and waiters to freeze in their tracks. My father ignored the spilled wine and the broken crystal. He leaned aggressively across the ruined table, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. His voice dropped to a low, menacing growl, vibrating with absolute malice. He told me that I thought I had won. He said I thought I was so incredibly smart sitting there with my fancy tablet and my secret company. He sneered, telling me that I thought I held all the cards tonight just because I had a little bit of leverage over Connor. Winston smiled a dark, cruel smile that sent a chill through the room. He leaned in closer, ensuring every single word carried the weight of a definitive, lethal threat. "You think you have won, Emily," he said, his voice dripping with pure venom. "You think you hold all the cards. You just made a fatal mistake." Winston stood over the ruined table, breathing heavily. The spilled red wine dripped slowly from the edge of the white tablecloth, staining the expensive carpet below. He did not look at Connor anymore. The disgraced son-in-law was entirely useless to him now. Winston only cared about regaining his absolute authority over me. He pointed his thick finger directly at my face and repeated that I had made a fatal mistake. He told me that coming into this restaurant and parading my secret venture capital firm around was the most foolish thing I could have ever done. He said I was entirely too arrogant for a woman who did not understand the true mechanics of family loyalty. I remained perfectly still in my chair. I looked up at my father and asked him what kind of loyalty he was referring to. I asked if he meant the kind of loyalty that allowed Connor to steal millions of dollars to buy my sister designer cars. Winston slammed his hand on the table again, demanding that I shut my mouth. He told me that Connor was a separate issue. He said that whatever financial mess Connor had created was between him and the federal government. Winston made it incredibly clear in that exact moment that he was perfectly willing to throw his golden son-in-law directly to the wolves if it meant saving his own skin. Chloe sobbed loudly, covering her face with her hands, but my father completely ignored her. He turned his dark, furious eyes back to me. He said that I had grown far too comfortable judging the people who gave me life. He said it was finally time for me to learn that my parents always held the ultimate leverage. My mother, Valerie, suddenly stopped trying to comfort Chloe. She looked up at Winston, and a silent understanding passed between them. The panic that had consumed her face just moments ago slowly began to recede. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek and stood up, straightening her posture. She moved to stand directly beside my father, forming a united toxic front. She looked down at me, and a cold, calculated smile crept back onto her face. She told me that Winston was absolutely right. She said I thought I was untouchable just because I had a fancy title and a lot of money in the bank. She said I was about to learn a very hard lesson about how the real world actually worked. Winston adjusted his suit jacket, regaining his arrogant composure. He looked around the private dining area, ensuring that our extended family was paying close attention. He wanted an audience for this grand revelation. He told me that 5 years ago his logistics company had hit a massive financial wall. He explained that the industry was changing rapidly, and his traditional business model was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. He said he was facing total bankruptcy and the complete loss of our family wealth. He needed a massive injection of institutional capital just to keep the lights on and maintain their pristine social standing. Winston smiled a dark, predatory smile. He said that unfortunately, his own credit score had been completely destroyed by a series of aggressive bad investments. My mother had also maxed out her personal credit lines to maintain their lavish lifestyle. They were entirely out of options, and traditional banks were threatening to call in their existing loans. They needed a clean slate. They needed a financial ghost. They needed someone with an absolutely flawless credit history and zero existing debt. Valerie let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated malice. She told me that I had always been such a quiet, boring little girl. She said I never asked them for a single dime after they threw me out of the house. I had worked 3 jobs, paid for my own tiny apartment, and painstakingly built a perfect credit score all by myself. She said my financial profile was absolutely pristine because I lived like a peasant. She told me that my responsible, independent nature made me the absolute perfect target for their survival plan. My father leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the back of his chair. He proudly admitted to the entire table that 5 years ago they took my social security number. He said it was incredibly easy to access my personal information since they were my parents. He boasted that they used my pristine identity to apply for massive high-interest commercial loans. They submitted fraudulent paperwork, claiming I was a silent partner in his failing logistics business. They forged my signature on dozens of legally binding financial documents. They pledged my flawless credit to secure millions of dollars in highly leveraged commercial debt. I sat there listening to my own parents joyfully confess to federal identity theft. I did not show a single ounce of surprise or fear. I let them continue their boastful, arrogant monologue. Winston practically beamed with pride as he explained the sheer brilliance of their criminal scheme. He said they secured the millions they needed to save the logistics company. They used the freshly laundered capital to pay off their immediate debts and secure their suburban mansion. They even used a portion of those forged loans to fund Chloe's extravagant destination wedding because they felt they deserved a proper celebration for successfully navigating a financial crisis. They reaped all the luxurious benefits while leaving the massive crushing liability entirely in my name. Valerie stepped closer to the table, her eyes wide with triumphant glee. She explained their twisted justification for committing felony fraud against their own daughter. She said that I owed them for bringing me into this world. She claimed that because they had put a roof over my head when I was a child, I was permanently indebted to them. She said that using my credit score was simply a mandatory family tax. It was a way for me to finally contribute to the household, since I had always refused to play by their rules. She actually believed that stealing my identity was a perfectly reasonable parenting strategy. Winston chimed in, adding that they had always considered those fraudulent loans to be their ultimate safety net. He said they knew that my independent nature would eventually lead me to build a successful career. They figured that if their logistics company ever went completely under, they would simply transfer the debt burden directly onto my shoulders. They believed I would be legally obligated to pay off their millions in high-interest loans to save my own credit score. They thought they had constructed a flawless, inescapable trap. The extended family sat frozen in their chairs. My aunts and uncles looked completely horrified. They had been perfectly willing to watch me pay a steep dinner bill, but hearing my parents proudly confess to orchestrating a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme against their own child was a bridge too far. They realized they were sitting at a table run by actual criminals. My aunt tried to speak to ask Winston if he was joking, but the words died in her throat. The sheer malice radiating from my parents was suffocating. Winston stood tall, feeling incredibly powerful. He looked at my iPad still resting on the table. He said he did not care how much money my venture capital firm controlled. He said he did not care that I had the power to destroy Connor. He believed that because my personal name was tied to their massive commercial loans, he possessed the ultimate leverage to force my absolute submission. He thought he could use my stolen identity to command my wealth. Valerie moved around the table until she was standing just a few feet away from my chair. She looked down at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, arrogant victory. She believed she had completely checkmated the daughter she despised. She thought she had reclaimed her position as the untouchable matriarch of the family. The fake, sweet motherly voice was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. She tilted her head and smirked, her eyes flashing with renewed confidence. She crossed her arms over her expensive designer gown and delivered her final devastating threat. She spoke slowly, ensuring every single word landed with maximum impact. "We have millions in debt under your name, Emily," she said, her voice ringing clearly across the silent dining room. "If we stop paying, you lose everything." The threat hung over the ruined dining table like a heavy physical weight. My mother stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling beneath her designer gown. She truly believed she had just delivered the ultimate killing blow. She expected to see my carefully maintained composure finally shatter into a million irreparable pieces. She waited for the color to drain from my face. She waited for the tears of absolute defeat to well up in my eyes. She wanted me to realize that despite my billions of dollars in venture capital and my hidden corporate empire, I was still entirely at her mercy. Winston stepped forward, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with his wife. He placed his hands on the back of his chair and leaned his significant weight forward. He looked down at me with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who was about to execute a ruthless business transaction. He told me that Valerie was absolutely right. He said that my precious position as a powerful chief executive officer was entirely dependent on maintaining a flawless public and financial record. I knew exactly how the venture capital ecosystem operated. He knew that institutional investors, pension funds, and university endowments required rigorous, immaculate background checks on the executives managing their capital. Winston smiled, his teeth flashing in the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. He laid out his demands with the casual arrogance of a mob boss delivering an extortion ultimatum. He told me that if I wanted to protect my firm and keep my spotless reputation completely intact, I was going to follow his instructions to the absolute letter. First, he commanded me to use Apex Vanguard to immediately inject a massive wave of clean institutional capital into Connor's failing startup. He said I was going to classify it as a strategic Series C funding round. He explicitly ordered me to use that fresh capital to quietly paper over the millions of dollars Connor had already embezzled. He demanded that I restructure the accounting internally so the federal investigators would never find a single trace of the stolen investor funds. Connor, who had been sitting in paralyzed terror just moments before, suddenly shifted in his seat. The realization that my parents were actively blackmailing me to save his skin breathed sudden, desperate life back into his fragile ego. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead and actually dared to straighten his silk tie. He looked at me, his chest puffing out slightly as he rode the coattails of my parents' criminal extortion. I had the absolute, unmitigated audacity to tell me that it was a standard corporate bailout. He said I had a fiduciary duty to protect the family name from a public scandal, and that injecting a few $1 million into his company was a small price to pay to keep everyone out of federal prison. My father ignored Connor and continued his relentless list of demands. He said that saving the Golden son-in-law was only the first step. Winston dictated that I would also personally assume the entirety of the fraudulent commercial loans they had taken out under my name. He said I had more than enough personal liquid wealth to pay off the millions in high-interest debt they had accumulated. He demanded that I wire the funds directly to their logistics company by the end of the week. He framed it as a mandatory retirement package. He said that once I cleared their massive debt and bailed out Connor, they would graciously allow me to return to my quiet, anonymous life without any further disruptions. Valerie chimed in, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet venom. She told me it was the perfect solution for everyone. She said Chloe would get to keep her beautiful suburban mansion, her designer bags, and her luxury vehicles. Connor would get to avoid a catastrophic federal indictment and maintain his status as a brilliant tech founder. My parents would get to retire in total absolute luxury without the crushing weight of their failing business. She smiled warmly, as if she were planning a lovely family vacation rather than orchestrating a multi-million-dollar blackmail scheme against her own daughter. She told me that all I had to do was open my checkbook and do what I was told. I asked them in a voice that betrayed absolutely no emotion, what would happen if I simply refused their generous offer? Winston let out a sharp, aggressive laugh. He slammed his hand against the wood of his chair. He told me that refusing was not an option. He explicitly outlined the devastating financial blast radius they were prepared to trigger. He said that if I did not agree to their exact terms right here and now, they would intentionally default on every single commercial loan tied to my social security number tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I explained the mechanics of the destruction with gleeful precision. He said the massive sudden defaults would instantly trigger automated alerts across every major credit bureau in the country. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing whisper. He told me that those credit alerts would immediately notify the Securities and Exchange Commission and the compliance boards overseeing my venture capital firm. He said the sudden appearance of millions of dollars in defaulted, fraudulent commercial debt would instantly trigger mandatory federal background check failures. He told me that my limited partners and institutional investors would pull their capital in a matter of hours. He promised me that my status as a powerful corporate executive would be permanently and violently destroyed before I even had the chance to finish my morning coffee. They firmly believed they had me perfectly checkmated in an inescapable corner. Chloe suddenly stopped crying. She looked up, her mascara slightly smudged, but her expression hardening with the same toxic entitlement that defined our parents. She looked at me and demanded that I just agree to the deal. She said I had more money than I could ever possibly spend, and that I owed it to her to fix this mess. She actually blamed me for exposing the embezzlement, claiming that if I had just stayed away and kept my mouth shut, none of this unpleasantness would be happening. She told me to stop being so incredibly selfish and to just use my secret company to save her husband, so she would not have to face the humiliation of losing her country club memberships. I sat perfectly still in my chair, allowing the sheer breathtaking magnitude of their delusion to wash over the table. The quiet hum of the upscale restaurant continued around us, completely detached from the absolute insanity unfolding in our private section. My extended family, the aunts and uncles who had watched this entire sequence of events, looked physically ill. They were staring at my parents as if they had just pulled off masks to reveal actual monsters underneath. They realized that my parents were not just harsh disciplinarians who favored one child over the other. They were calculated, ruthless criminals who were perfectly willing to completely destroy their own flesh and blood to maintain a superficial facade of wealth. I did not break down. I did not look scared. I did not drop to my knees and beg my father for mercy or plead with my mother to spare my professional reputation. I simply watched them. I observed the arrogant set of Winston's jaw. I watched the malicious, greedy light dancing in Valerie's eyes. I saw the desperate, pathetic relief washing over Connor's sweaty face. They were so incredibly confident in their crude, primitive blackmail strategy. They genuinely believed that they could manipulate the founder of a multi-hundred-million-dollar financial institution, using the exact same bullying tactics they used when I was an insecure teenager living under their roof. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of submission or defeat. It was a smile of absolute clinical amusement. The realization of how profoundly stupid and outclassed they truly were was almost intoxicating. They had spent their entire lives underestimating my intelligence, and tonight that fatal flaw was going to cost them everything they held dear. I slowly pushed my chair back slightly, giving myself more room to maneuver. I reached down to the floor beside my feet, where my structured leather briefcase had been resting silently throughout the entire dinner. I unzipped the main compartment with a smooth, fluid motion. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a pen to sign over my firm's capital. Instead, I reached inside and firmly grasped a thick, heavy stack of crisp manila legal folders. I lifted the folders and placed them squarely onto the only dry section of the white linen tablecloth, avoiding the spreading pool of spilled red wine. The heavy thud of the dense paperwork hitting the table made Connor jump slightly in his seat. The arrogant smirks on my parents' faces faltered just a fraction of an inch, replaced by a sudden creeping wave of uncertainty. They stared at the legal documents, their minds struggling to comprehend why the daughter they had just successfully blackmailed was looking at them with such radiant, terrifying confidence. I rested my hands flat on top of the crisp manila folders. I looked directly into my father's dark, angry eyes, and then shifted my gaze to my mother's suddenly nervous face. I let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds, ensuring I had their complete, undivided attention. I spoke in a voice that was smooth, resonant, and laced with absolute lethal authority. Did you honestly think I didn't run a deep dive background check on myself before launching a multi-hundred-million-dollar VC fund? The question echoed across our private dining section, hanging in the air with the sharp, terrifying clarity of a newly sharpened blade. My mother Valerie suddenly stopped breathing. Her chest froze midway through a shallow intake of air. The malicious, triumphant light that had been dancing in her eyes just a second ago was instantly extinguished. My father Winston gripped the back of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white against his dark skin. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a naive, obedient child who could be easily manipulated with loud voices and financial threats. It had genuinely never occurred to them that a woman who managed hundreds of millions of dollars in institutional capital would possess a security and compliance apparatus more powerful than most government agencies. I did not wait for them to formulate a pathetic excuse. I reached across the pristine white linen tablecloth, deliberately avoiding the spreading pool of spilled red wine. I placed my manicured hand firmly on top of the crisp manila legal folders I had just pulled from my briefcase. I slid the first heavy folder directly across the table until it rested squarely in front of Winston. I slid the second identical folder across the table until it touched Valerie's silver charger plate. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs and resting my hands in my lap. I watched them stare at the closed folders as if I had just handed them a pair of live explosive devices. Winston was a man accustomed to being in absolute control of every business dealing, but right now his hands were visibly trembling. He slowly reached out and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover of the folder. Valerie hesitated for a long moment before mirroring his actions, pulling her own folder closer and opening it with stiff, jerky movements. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the cool, clinical authority of my tone wash over the silent, terrified table. I told them that exactly 8 months ago, Apex Vanguard was preparing to launch our third major regional investment fund. I explained that whenever a venture capital firm structures a new fund of that massive magnitude, the federal regulatory bodies require comprehensive, exhaustive background checks on every single managing partner and executive officer. I told them that my chief compliance officer, a former federal prosecutor who misses absolutely nothing, walked into my penthouse office holding a very thick, very disturbing file. I watched Winston's eyes dart frantically across the first page of the documents I had provided. I told the table that my compliance team had uncovered a massive, highly toxic web of commercial debt tied directly to my personal Social Security number. I described the profound, sickening sense of betrayal I felt when my compliance officer showed me the original loan origination documents. I looked directly at my mother and told her that I had to sit in my office and stare at my own forged handwriting on dozens of legally binding financial contracts I had never seen before in my entire life. I explained the sheer, sloppy, breathtaking arrogance of their criminal enterprise. They had forged my signature to secure millions of dollars in subprime commercial loans, but they had been lazy enough to use the corporate address of Winston's failing logistics company as the primary contact point. They had pledged my flawless, pristine credit history to predatory lenders, because every traditional reputable bank in the state of Georgia had already blacklisted Winston for his aggressive and reckless financial mismanagement. Chloe let out a small, terrified whimper, pressing her hand over her mouth. She was finally beginning to understand the catastrophic scope of what our parents had done to maintain her unearned luxury. I looked at my sister and told her that our parents had quite literally mortgaged my identity and my financial future, so she could have a lavish destination wedding in the Caribbean, and so Connor could have a desperate injection of seed money for his fraudulent startup. They had stolen my name to fund her golden existence. I turned my attention back to my parents. I told them that when I first discovered the felony identity theft 8 months ago, my initial instinct was to call the federal authorities that very same afternoon. I wanted to storm into their sprawling suburban mansion with the police and watch them be hauled away in handcuffs for what they had done to me. But I realized that confronting a narcissist with raw emotion only gives them ammunition to play the victim. I knew that if I confronted them immediately, they would hire aggressive defense attorneys, drag me into a messy, prolonged family court battle, and try to twist the narrative to make it look like a simple family misunderstanding. They would hide their remaining assets and file for strategic bankruptcy to protect themselves while leaving my credit profile tied up in endless litigation. I told Winston that in the world of high-level venture capital, you never show your hand until the trap is already permanently closed. I needed them to feel perfectly safe. I needed them to believe that their twisted, malicious safety net was fully operational while I systematically and quietly cut every single rope holding them up. I played the long game. I explained the exact strategic mechanism I used to dismantle their lives. I told them that instead of reporting the fraud immediately, I used a fraction of my personal capital to establish an anonymous proxy holding company registered in Delaware. I deployed my top-tier corporate acquisition lawyers to quietly approach the predatory commercial lenders holding the debt for Winston's logistics company. I told my father that his creditors were absolutely thrilled to hear from my proxy firm. Those lenders knew exactly how terrible his business model was. They knew his logistics company was a rapidly sinking ship, and they were desperate to offload his highly toxic, high-risk loans before he inevitably defaulted. I watched Winston's chest heave as he flipped to the second page of the legal dossier. I explained that my anonymous proxy firm offered to buy the entirety of his commercial debt from those original lenders. Because the debt was considered extremely high risk and dangerously close to default, I was able to purchase the entire portfolio for absolute pennies on the dollar. I bought their massive multi-million-dollar liability at a staggering discount. I bought the commercial liens on his warehouse properties. I bought the secondary collateral agreements tied to their personal bank accounts. I bought the entire financial foundation of their existence without them ever suspecting a single thing. Valerie was staring at the legal documents in her folder, but her eyes were glazed over. She lacked the corporate financial literacy to fully comprehend the dense legal jargon printed on the pages. She could see the massive numbers and the terrifying red stamps indicating legal transfer of ownership, but she could not grasp the exact mechanical nature of her ruin. She looked desperately toward Winston, relying on his business background to translate the horror laid out in front of them. Winston was a man who understood debt. He understood leverage. And right now he was reading the formal legal transfer of deed and debt ownership. His eyes scanned the heavy black text detailing the complete reassignment of his multi-million-dollar commercial loans. He read the name of the anonymous Delaware limited liability company that had purchased his financial soul. Then he read the chain of custody documentation that legally bound that Delaware proxy firm directly back to the parent company. He read the words Apex Vanguard printed clearly and boldly at the bottom of the page alongside my official digital signature as the sole managing member and acquiring entity. The crushing, devastating weight of his absolute realization hit him like a physical blow. The arrogant, powerful patriarch who had just threatened to destroy my life by intentionally defaulting on his loans suddenly realized that he no longer owed that money to an anonymous bank. He realized that the blackmail threat he had just so proudly delivered was completely, entirely useless. He had threatened to blow up a building without realizing I already owned the detonator. Winston's hands began to shake uncontrollably, causing the crisp legal papers to rattle against the dining table. The dark purple flush of rage that had colored his face just moments ago drained away instantly, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked up from the manila folder. He did not look at Valerie. He did not look at Connor or Chloe. He looked directly at me, his eyes wide with a profound, inescapable terror. His voice was barely a hoarse whisper, completely stripped of its former booming authority. "You own the debt." I smiled a very slow, very cold smile. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, holding his horrified gaze with the absolute unyielding dominance of an apex predator who had just locked its jaws around its prey. "I don't just own the debt, Dad. I own you." Winston sat completely paralyzed in his chair. His chest stopped moving entirely. The sheer force of my statement hung over the ruined dining table like a heavy guillotine blade waiting to drop. He looked down at the crisp legal documents resting in front of him. He traced the authorized signature of my proxy firm with his trembling index finger, as if physically touching the dark ink would somehow change the reality of his absolute ruin. How, as a man who had spent his entire adult life building a towering fortress of intimidation and financial dominance over our family, now he was sitting trapped inside a steel cage that his own daughter had custom-built specifically for him. I did not let him catch his breath. I leaned back in my chair and smoothed the fabric of my emerald green dress, projecting total relaxation. I explained the brutal mechanical reality of his current situation. I told him that commercial loans of that massive magnitude come with incredibly strict covenants and highly binding legal clauses. I explained that securing millions of dollars in corporate funding using a stolen identity constitutes a fundamental catastrophic breach of contract. I told him that because the origination of his business debt was entirely fraudulent, the loans do not operate under normal standard repayment schedules anymore. I watched his dark eyes widen as the severe financial terminology registered in his panicking brain. I stated clearly and coldly that his debt was currently and permanently in default. I explained that a breach of contract based on felony identity theft automatically triggers an immediate acceleration clause. I told my father that every single penny of the multi-million-dollar debt they had accumulated over the last 5 years was due right now today. I promised him there would be no flexible payment plans. There would be no desperate negotiations. There would be no 30-day grace period to save his logistics company. Valerie suddenly slammed her hands flat against the table. The sudden aggressive movement rattled the expensive silverware, but she did not care. Her face was flushed an angry, panicked shade of red. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, and spat out that I was bluffing. She claimed that I could never actually prove they were the ones who forged the financial documents. She said it was just my word against theirs. She told me that they would simply hire the absolute best defense attorneys in Atlanta and claimed that I had signed those loan papers willingly to help the family. She desperately insisted that a court of law would never believe a runaway daughter over her own respectable parents. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or defend my position. I simply lowered my gaze to the center of the white linen tablecloth. I looked at my sleek smartphone, which had been sitting face up next to my water glass for the entire duration of the dinner. I slowly reached out and tapped the bright glowing screen with my index finger. I looked back up at my mother, holding her terrified gaze with unwavering intensity. I kept my voice perfectly level and exceptionally clear, so there could be no misunderstanding. I told her that the state of Georgia is a one-party consent state for audio recording. I explained exactly what that specific legal statute meant. I told her it means I do not need her permission or her knowledge to record a conversation as long as I am an active participant in the discussion. I watched the blood drain completely from Valerie's face, leaving her skin a chalky ashen gray. I tapped the phone screen one more time, stopping the high-definition audio recording application that had been running quietly since the exact moment we sat down at the table. I told my parents that they had just loudly and proudly confessed to felony identity theft and federal bank fraud. I reminded them that they had boasted about stealing my social security number to fund Chloe's destination wedding and Connor's failing tech startup. I pointed out that they had done this in a public restaurant in front of 20 extended family members who were all sitting here right now as direct legal witnesses to their uncoerced confession. The aunts and uncles sitting around our private dining section collectively held their breath. They realized I had just turned every single one of them into a subpoenaed witness for a federal fraud trial. They looked at Valerie and Winston with expressions of pure horror, distancing themselves physically by leaning far back in their chairs. The rigid social hierarchy of the family had not just been flipped, it had been completely incinerated. The people who had silently watched my parents abuse me for years were now terrified of being implicated in their massive criminal conspiracy. Winston tried to salvage the unsalvageable. His voice cracked as he attempted to regain his shattered patriarchal authority. He told me that I was destroying the proud family name. He said that if I pursued this aggressive course of action, I would send my own flesh and blood parents to federal prison. He desperately tried to leverage the deep familial guilt that used to control me when I was a helpless teenager. He pleaded with me to just hand over the audio recording and transfer the commercial debt back to a traditional bank so they could figure it out. He promised that if I just let them walk away tonight, they would never bother me or ask me for a single thing ever again. I looked at my father with absolute clinical detachment. I told him that he lost the right to invoke the family name the day he threw me out of his house for refusing to work for his failing company. I told him he lost the right to expect my loyalty or my protection the exact moment he stole my identity to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. I explained that I did not come to this graduation dinner to negotiate a friendly settlement. I came to deliver a permanent consequence. Chloe began to weep loudly, her manicured hands covering her face. She grabbed Connor's arm, shaking him and begging him to fix it to use his startup money to make the nightmare go away. But Connor was completely unresponsive. He was staring blankly at the white linen tablecloth, a broken, devastated man who realized his entire life of unearned luxury was officially over. He knew he had absolutely no money to save her or himself. I turned my attention directly to Chloe and Connor. I told them that I did not wait for this dinner to take action against the people who sought to destroy me. I explained that when you hold the ultimate leverage, you do not give your enemies the chance to hide their stolen assets or board an international flight out of the country. I looked at my parents and told them that their sprawling suburban mansion, the one they had fraudulently financed using my pristine credit score, was already gone. I informed them that my dedicated legal team had officially initiated the foreclosure proceedings at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I told them that the commercial bank accounts tied to their logistics company had been frozen by a judge's order before they even put on their expensive clothes for this dinner tonight. Then I looked directly at Connor. I watched him flinch as my intense gaze locked onto him. I told him that my lawyers did not just audit his company for my own personal amusement. I informed him that my legal team had packaged his entire highly confidential financial ledger, the undeniable proof of his massive embezzlement, and the detailed records of his stolen investor funds into a neat, comprehensive dossier. I told him that my attorneys handed that exact dossier directly over to the Securities and Exchange Commission yesterday afternoon. Connor let out a choked, strangled gasp that sounded like a dying animal. He buried his face in his trembling hands, realizing that federal financial investigators were already tearing his entire startup apart, looking for the stolen millions. The arrogant white knight of the family had been completely and utterly neutralized, stripped of his fake wealth and his unearned pride. The entire table sat in a state of absolute ruined silence. My parents had walked into this exclusive restaurant expecting to humiliate me with a massive dinner bill. They had expected to exert their supreme parental authority and force me into permanent financial submission by threatening to ruin my credit. Instead, they were leaving with absolutely nothing. They had no mansion. They had no logistics company. They had no golden son-in-law to brag about. They had no pristine reputation left to uphold. They had absolutely nowhere left to run and no one left to manipulate. I picked up my smartphone from the table and slipped it back into my designer clutch. I closed the metal clasp with a sharp, defining snap that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet dining room. I looked past my mother and my father. I looked directly through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the exclusive steakhouse. The dark Atlanta night was suddenly illuminated. Brilliant flashing beams of red and blue light began to reflect aggressively against the polished glass, painting the terrified faces of my family in harsh alternating colors. The red and blue lights flashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the restaurant shattered the heavy silence at our table. The vibrant colors painted my parents' terrified faces in harsh alternating strokes of crimson and sapphire. Winston and Valerie sat completely paralyzed, staring out the window as multiple Atlanta police cruisers and dark unmarked federal vehicles swerved violently onto the curb. The sheer volume of law enforcement descending upon the exclusive steakhouse was staggering to witness. Diners at other tables stood up from their expensive meals, murmuring in deep confusion and sudden alarm. My extended family, my aunts, uncles, and cousins began to panic, shifting frantically in their seats as they realized the absolute magnitude of what was happening. They had watched my parents boldly confess to federal crimes just moments ago, and now the physical manifestation of those severe crimes was parking directly outside the front doors. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open with intense force. Over a dozen uniformed police officers and plainclothes federal agents strode into the elegant dining room. Their presence was a massive, sudden disruption to the refined, upscale atmosphere. The general manager, who had treated me with such profound reverence earlier, rushed forward to intercept them. A lead detective simply flashed a golden badge, and the manager immediately stepped aside, pointing a shaking finger directly toward our private section. I sat perfectly still in my chair, smoothing the fabric of my emerald green dress. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I felt a profound, icy calm settling over my entire body. I watched the agents march purposefully across the plush carpet, their eyes locked entirely on our table. Chloe let out a high-pitched, terrified whimper and grabbed Connor by the arm. She was shaking violently, burying her face into his expensive custom suit. I looked at my father, Winston, who was currently hyperventilating. I spoke to him in a very clear, steady voice over the rising commotion of the restaurant. I told him that I did not call the police during dinner. I explained that in the ruthless world of high-level venture capital, you never leave a single vital detail to chance. I revealed that my corporate legal team had been quietly collaborating directly with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the federal prosecutor's office for over 3 weeks. I told my father that I had personally handed over every single piece of undeniable physical evidence detailing his massive identity theft and Connor's extensive embezzlement scheme long before I ever sent my reply for this graduation dinner. I told them the arrest warrants were signed, sealed, and completely finalized by a federal judge yesterday morning. I was just waiting for the absolute perfect moment to execute them. The lead detective reached our table and immediately flanked Connor. 2 federal agents stepped up right behind him, effectively blocking any possible avenue of escape. The detective looked down at my brother-in-law and stated his full name with absolute cold authority. Connor tried to stand up desperately, trying to project the arrogant white knight persona he had worn so proudly all evening. He puffed out his chest and demanded to know what was going on, claiming he was a highly respected tech founder and a personal friend of the mayor. He told the federal agents they were making a massive, embarrassing mistake that would undoubtedly cost them their jobs. The federal agent did not even blink. He reached forward, grabbed Connor by the arm, and roughly twisted his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed clearly over the loud gasps of my extended family. The agent loudly and firmly read Connor his Miranda rights, detailing the specific charges of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal tax evasion. Connor's knees completely buckled beneath him. The smug, wealthy arrogance melted off his face instantly, leaving behind a pale, weeping coward. He did not look like a powerful titan of industry anymore. He looked like exactly what he was, a pathetic criminal fraud who had finally been caught by the authorities. Chloe screamed, reaching out to grab her husband as the agents pulled him aggressively away from the table. She sobbed hysterically, clutching her designer handbag, begging the officers to please let him go. She cried out that they had a beautiful mansion and a perfect life, and that this had to be some kind of horrible misunderstanding. One of the agents looked at her with pure intense pity and told her to step back immediately unless she wanted to be charged as an active accessory to his financial crimes. Chloe instantly froze, dropping her hands and backing away from her husband, terrified of losing her own freedom. The remaining detectives immediately turned their unyielding attention to the head of the table. They surrounded my father Winston and my mother Valerie. Winston tried to maintain his rigid patriarchal authority. He stood up, puffing out his chest, and aggressively told the officers to get their hands off him. He shouted that he was a prominent business owner in Atlanta and that he demanded to speak to his highly paid attorney right this second. The detectives were completely unfazed by his loud, booming voice. They had dealt with arrogant, white-collar criminals 1,000 times before. Two officers stepped forward and physically subdued my father, forcing his arms firmly behind his broad back. Winston grunted in deep pain and total humiliation as the heavy steel cuffs were slapped aggressively onto his wrists. The man who had spent his entire life bullying and intimidating our family was permanently reduced to a struggling captive in the middle of a public restaurant. Then the officers moved directly to my mother. Valerie was completely paralyzed in her chair. The fake, sweet, motherly facade she had worn for 35 years completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at the steel handcuffs being presented to her, and she began to hyperventilate loudly. Her expensive designer gown suddenly looked completely ridiculous on her shaking, trembling frame as the female officer grabbed her arms and secured the metal cuffs around her wrists. Valerie absolutely broke down. She lost every single ounce of her carefully cultivated country club dignity. She started sobbing wildly, the tears ruining her makeup and streaming down her face. She looked frantically around the dining room, realizing that dozens of wealthy, influential patrons were actively watching her public destruction. She realized that her pristine social reputation, the only thing she truly cared about, was permanently, violently eradicated. Valerie desperately turned her head and locked her terrified, crying eyes directly onto me. The woman who had told me just an hour ago that I was an embarrassing failure suddenly realized I was the only person in the entire universe who possessed the immense power to save her. She threw away her massive pride and began to beg. She strained against the firm grip of the police officers leaning toward me across the ruined dining table. She sobbed hysterically, screaming my name over and over again. She begged me to call off the police. She pleaded with me to use my vast money and my powerful corporate lawyers to make this awful nightmare stop. She screamed that she loved me and that I could not send my own mother to federal prison. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly stood up from my chair, standing tall and perfectly poised in my emerald green dress. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small and utterly worthless. I looked at the father who had thrown me out on the street and the sister who had happily benefited from my stolen identity. I felt a profound, absolute sense of peace settling deeply into my bones. I walked slowly around the edge of the large table until I was standing right in front of my mother. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with desperate, pathetic hope. She thought the familial bond she had abused for decades would somehow save her at the very last second. I looked down at her. My expression was like solid, unyielding ice. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly enough for her, for my father, and for my entire horrified extended family to hear every single syllable. I looked directly into her eyes and repeated the exact vicious words she had spoken to me at the very beginning of this graduation dinner. I said, "Live your lives as though there was never a daughter named Emily." I picked up my designer clutch from the table and walked gracefully toward the exit, leaving the police to drag my toxic family out into the dark night. 6 months have passed since that explosive, unforgettable night at the upscale steakhouse. The passage of time has a remarkable way of filtering out the chaotic noise and revealing the absolute, unvarnished truth of who people really are. The federal justice system moves with a slow, deliberate, and entirely merciless grinding motion, especially when they are handed a perfectly packaged, comprehensive dossier of undeniable financial crimes. Connor is currently sitting in a stark concrete federal detention center, awaiting his criminal trial. The arrogant white knight, who used to mock my education and loudly boast about his brilliant startup, is now wearing a standard issue uniform, and eating terrible institutional food. His expensive custom-tailored suits, his flashy watches, and his aggressive boardroom posture have been completely violently stripped away. I is facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and federal tax evasion. His tech startup was immediately seized and systematically dismantled by federal regulators. His stolen offshore assets were completely frozen, and his fraudulent corporate empire was permanently erased from existence. He desperately tried to offer a plea deal by throwing his board members and associates under the bus, but the forensic accounting evidence my firm provided was so incredibly thorough that the prosecutors did not even need his cooperation. He is learning the hard way that real power in corporate America is not about snapping your fingers at waitstaff or belittling women. It is about absolute accountability, and he is currently paying the ultimate devastating price for his arrogant, bottomless greed. The financial blast radius did not simply stop with Connor. Chloe was completely and violently severed from her unearned luxury in a matter of days. For her entire life, my younger sister was heavily shielded from the harsh, brutal realities of the world by the massive enabling safety net our parents provided. She never had to worry about paying a basic utility bill or affording groceries because she was always the protected golden child. Today, Chloe is completely, unequivocally broke. The federal government swiftly seized the two matte black luxury vehicles and publicly auctioned off her massive collection of seasonal designer handbags just to pay back a fraction of the defrauded investors. She was forced to vacate her sprawling suburban mansion the moment the asset freeze hit their accounts. She is now living in a cramped, incredibly small one-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of Atlanta. For the first time in her 30 years of privileged life, Chloe has been forced to get an actual job. She is currently working a demanding minimum wage retail position at a local shopping mall, folding clothes and dealing with difficult, aggressive customers for basic hourly pay. She has finally been forced to experience the real, unforgiving world without a financial parachute. She used to laugh at my quiet independence and mock my relentless, grueling work ethic. But now she is completely dependent on those exact same survival skills just to keep the lights on in her small apartment. The superficial, wealthy friends she used to entertain on lavish, expensive vacations immediately abandoned her. The absolute second, her money vanished, leaving her to face her bleak, terrifying new reality entirely alone. My parents. Winston and Valerie experienced the most severe and spectacular public downfall of all. The sprawling suburban mansion they loved to flaunt to their country club friends is permanently gone. I did exactly what I promised I would do at that dinner table. I executed the commercial foreclosure without a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. The massive property was legally seized. The locks were professionally changed, and their pristine physical symbol of wealth was completely liquidated to satisfy the massive fraudulent debt they had selfishly accumulated. They are currently facing their own lengthy federal prison sentences for felony identity theft and aggressive bank fraud. The high-definition audio recording from the graduation dinner, where they loudly and proudly confessed to stealing my social security number to fund their lavish lifestyle, became the absolute devastating cornerstone of the federal prosecutor's case against them. But the legal consequences are only a small fraction of their ultimate punishment. The complete social ruin they feared more than anything else in the world is absolute and permanent. Our extended family. The aunts, uncles, and cousins who had sat in that private dining room and witnessed their monstrous behavior completely severed all ties. The people who used to tolerate their arrogance and nod along with their toxic hierarchy watched them happily confess to destroying their own daughter for pure financial gain. My parents are completely shunned by the very society they sacrificed everything to impress. They have no money, no mansion, no golden child to parade around, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. They are entirely isolated, left to drown in the toxic, rotting ruins of their own making. The contrast between their absolute ruin and my current reality is nothing short of breathtaking. I am standing in the massive penthouse office of Apex Vanguard, located on the top floor of a towering, sleek glass skyscraper. The expansive floor-to-ceiling windows offer a stunning, uninterrupted panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city lights stretch out for miles, glowing brightly against the deep velvet darkness of the evening sky. This is the empire I built from the ground up with my own two hands and my own relentless intellect. I did not need a stolen identity or embezzled investor funds to secure this magnificent space. I built this massive financial institution through sheer relentless determination, razor-sharp strategy, and an unwavering, absolute refusal to be defeated. Tonight, the penthouse is not filled with aggressive corporate negotiations or high-stakes boardroom meetings. The large executive office has been transformed into a warm, beautiful space for a very private, intimate celebration. Soft, smooth jazz plays from the hidden architectural speakers, and the air is filled with the sound of genuine, joyful laughter. I am surrounded by my chosen family. These are not people who share my blood, but they are people who deeply share my core values. I am standing with my loyal friends who supported me when I was working 3 minimum-wage jobs just to survive. I am standing with my brilliant, dedicated colleagues who respect my leadership and trust my strategic vision. I am standing with the incredible seasoned mentors who recognized my raw potential and helped me navigate the ruthless, unforgiving venture capital ecosystem. There is absolutely no toxic hierarchy in this room. There is no passive aggression, no subtle emotional manipulation, and no one deliberately tearing me down to make themselves feel taller. There is only mutual respect, authentic human connection, and absolute unconditional support. I look around at the smiling faces of the people who genuinely uplift me, and I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of deep, lasting peace. I reach out and pick up a slender crystal flute filled with expensive vintage champagne. The delicate golden bubbles rise to the surface, catching the warm, ambient light of the office. I walk slowly toward the massive windows looking down at the vibrant, bustling city below. I reflect on the incredible, painful, and ultimately triumphant journey that brought me to this exact moment. I spent my entire childhood and my early adult years believing that I was fundamentally flawed because the people who were supposed to love me treated me like a worthless burden. I exhausted myself for decades trying to earn basic validation from a mother and father who were completely incapable of seeing my true worth. But surviving their emotional abuse and their relentless daily toxicity was the most rigorous and valuable education I could have ever received. They taught me how to identify manipulation from a mile away. They taught me how to operate with cold clinical precision when faced with aggressive hostile opposition. They taught me that true power does not come from loud, arrogant boasting or unearned financial privilege. True power comes from absolute self-reliance and the quiet, unyielding confidence of knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you are capable of achieving. I gently tap my crystal glass with a silver spoon, mirroring the exact action my mother took at that disastrous graduation dinner 6 months ago. But this time, the ringing sound does not signal the beginning of a cruel public humiliation. It signals the ultimate permanent victory of a woman who completely refused to be broken. My friends and colleagues turn toward me, raising their own glasses in silent, supportive anticipation. I look at my chosen family, and I smile a bright, genuine, beautiful smile. I raise my glass of champagne high into the air, offering a silent toast to the incredible, completely liberated life I have built. I realize in this quiet, perfect moment that cutting my toxic family out of my life, permanently and unapologetically, was the absolute greatest graduation gift I could have ever possibly given myself. The most powerful lesson from Emily's story is that self-worth should never depend on the approval of people who consistently refuse to see your value. For years, Emily's family treated love like a reward that had to be earned. They praised Chloe for superficial achievements, while dismissing Emily's education, independence, discipline, and intelligence. Emily spent much of her life being treated as the family scapegoat, but their judgment never reflected her true ability. It only revealed their prejudice, insecurity, and need for control. Emily's journey teaches us that quiet progress is still progress. While her family was busy showing off expensive clothes, luxury homes, and social status, Emily was building something real. She invested in her education, developed her professional skills, and created financial independence without asking for their help. She did not need to announce every achievement or prove herself through constant arguments. Her preparation became her protection. Another important lesson is that boundaries are not acts of cruelty. When Emily told her family to live as though she had never existed, she was not being heartless. She was finally refusing to participate in a relationship built on humiliation, manipulation, and exploitation. Walking away from toxic people does not mean that you never loved them. Sometimes it means that you have finally learned to love and protect yourself. The story also demonstrates that people who underestimate others often become careless. Emily's parents and brother-in-law believed she was weak, unsuccessful, and financially powerless. Their arrogance caused them to reveal their crimes, threats, and intentions openly. They were so confident that Emily could be controlled that they never considered the possibility that she had already prepared for their attack. True strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the ability to remain calm while others expose themselves. However, Emily's victory was not simply about money, status, or revenge. Her greatest victory was emotional freedom. Owning the building, controlling a successful company, and exposing Connor's fraud gave her power, but those things did not create her worth. She had always been valuable. The real transformation occurred when she stopped waiting for her family to acknowledge that truth. This story reminds us to document wrongdoing, prepare carefully, build independence, and never allow guilt to force us into supporting people who repeatedly harm us. Family relationships should be based on respect, honesty, and mutual care, not fear, obligation, or financial exploitation. In the end, success is not about proving your enemies wrong. It is about reaching a place where their opinion no longer controls your decisions. Emily did not win because her family finally recognized her power. She won because she no longer needed their recognition. If Emily's journey inspired you to protect your peace and recognize your own worth, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories.